The president of South Korea has declared martial law, vowing to target what he calls corrupt opposition lawmakers. Just what is going on, and what does this mean for the West? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's try to talk about it. Okay, so this is a fast developing situation that is a little tough to tease out, but we're going to try to get the facts down and maybe try to get some insight into the president's internal calculus. So this is South Korea's President Yoon, who's declared emergency martial law. And while this in South Korea seems to be something that is meant to be reserved for an emergency like the North attacking. He's currently implemented it in response to what he calls the opposition parties' anti-state activities and pro-North Korean. He says, quote, to safeguard a liberal South Korea from the threats posed by North Korea's communist forces and to eliminate anti-state elements, I hereby declare emergency martial law. He continued, quote, this is an unavoidable measure to ensure the freedom and safety of the people and guarantee the sustainability of the nation against the unrest stirred by these subversive anti-state elements. He then provides some concrete rationale. He says, quote, the National Assembly has also completely cut budgets essential for national operations, drug crime prevention, and public safety, undermining the core functions of the state. This has left our citizens in a state of chaos, with the nation becoming a haven for drugs and public safety collapsing, right? In fact, General Park An-seo, the martial law commander, has announced that there is a prohibition on all political activities, including those of the National Assembly, local councils, political parties, political associations, and assemblies and demonstrations, right? The order also prohibited labor strikes and slowdowns, as well as gatherings that incite social disorder, which basically could be any gathering at all. And all media will be placed under control of martial law command. Right. He says any attempts that deny or attempt to overthrow the liberal democratic system, as well as the dissemination of fake news, manipulation of public opinion, or false propaganda, the order said. Healthcare workers, including doctors who are recently on strike, must return to work within 48 hours. He says, quote, violation of this proclamation will be subject to arrest, detention, search, and seizure without a warrant. Now, this is sort of insane, and it's insane for a bunch of reasons. But what I want to try to do is get to kind of the internal calculus, at least from what we know right now. But before we get into that, I want to mention that if you're interested in some uncensored combat footage and you're interested in supporting this channel that covers some of the most controversial topics, and certainly advertisers and sponsors are in no hurry to sponsor any videos. So I depend on you guys over on combatvetnews.com to support me. We have hundreds of videos on there dating back to the start of the Ukraine war, all kinds of combat videos. You can literally trace the war's evolution from the outset. We also just got access to some exclusive drone footage. This is stuff that no one else has from the front lines of Ukraine. Some of the units I made contact with reached out and said, hey, here's some of our Mavic operators. Here's some of our FPV operators. And so we checked out that footage today. So you want to become a member, link is in the description. Okay. So here's where things kind of get a little sideways, right? Now, the BBC has kind of an ongoing update here. Now, South Korean lawmakers have passed a motion to demand that the president lift martial law imposed a few hours ago. Speaker of the National Assembly has officially notified the president's office and the defense ministry. Legally, this should be sufficient for the president to lift martial law. But politically, it's a wait and see, right? And this is pretty troubling because, again, this is something where the declaration of martial law itself is not illegal. That seems to be a power that the South Korean president has. But refusing the National Assembly their check on martial law would transition this from martial law to a coup. Why? Because in a coup, you're throwing out the old order. And you notice that in his martial law declaration, he banned all political activities, including those in the National Assembly, meaning that by his own rationale, by his own sort of internal martial law logic, the National Assembly can't pass legislation demanding an end to martial law because they aren't legally able to meet to perform any political activities. This is really troubling. For context, South Korea was a dictatorship until 1987, in which case it became a democracy. And so the question is this a political crisis that will be resolved with the institutions of South Korea intact, or is this a sign of actual liberal backsliding, a democracy becoming an autocracy? It's pretty worrying. And so let's talk a little bit about kind of the perspective of why the president feels the need to do this. On one hand, he says that yes, the opposition party has cut large portions of the South Korean state budget, which is itself a problem. They've also diminished, let's see if I can find it here. The declaration of martial law comes a day after the opposition party, the Democratic Party, which has a majority in parliament, put forward a motion to impeach some of South Korea's top prosecutors as they investigate the opposition party leader, Lee. Right? The opposition sees the investigations as a political campaign against Lee, who's been seen as the favorite for the next presidential election in the 2027 polls. Right? You also have Yoon, who has the opposite problem. Yoon's popularity has declined in recent months as he dismissed calls for an independent investigation into scandals involving his wife and top officials, where even political rivals, of course, say he's wrong to do so. And so it sounds like there is pretty standard politicization of the criminal justice system, in which both sides are trying to quash investigations into their people and trying to launch investigations into the opposition. This is not really anything exceptional, if we're honest. This has been something that's gone on in some capacity, maybe not in South Korea, but this is pretty standard stuff in most representative democracies, where if you want to have a law enforcement organ that answers to elected officials, then those elected officials are going to use that in some capacity to further their political objectives. This is something that's kind of emblematic to a lot of liberal democracies in great and small ways, right? Certainly in the United States, we've seen this as well. So the question is there anything, but has he offered any evidence that the opposition lawmakers are like trying to destroy the South Korean state? This is something he hasn't really put out there, right? Just like he hasn't really put out evidence that the North Koreans are involved in any way, shape, or form. And so that's why it seems to have risen beyond simple criticism of the opposition party and their hardball tactics to I'm going to use martial law to subvert democracy entirely. Now, the other sort of problem that I have and that I worry about is this rollback of a larger liberal world order. Why? Well, again, I look at the Ukraine conflict as a symbol, not a symbol. It is a literal conflict between autocracies, right? These are dictatorships that have a top-down singular leader who makes decisions about the country, and Western democracies. Now, Western democracies, in the case of the Ukraine conflict, represent many times the people and economic size of Russia, the belligerent. And Russia has some allies. They have North Korea as an ally. They have China as an ally, right? And the problem is the world, and one of the things I've said throughout this conflict for months and months, that the world is watching. They're watching to see if democracies can actually fight and win against an autocratic regime, right? And the truth is that the West and its democratic allies have consistently underperformed, right? Russia produces more artillery shells. They field much more people. Their autocratic allies like North Korea provide vastly more support, including their literal direct military combatants to Russia to fight and win this war. And so if you are someone like South Korea, right, if you're President Yoon, and even some of President Yoon's supporters in all likelihood, they're probably looking and they're saying, how can South Korea, if South Korea becomes the next Ukraine, we cannot fight that war as a democracy because of how unbelievably weak democracies look. And I think that's one of the reasons why Yoon is probably citing the North Korean threat as part of his reason for this. Not to say, and he's like, there's North Korean communist subversion efforts, likely true, but he wants to evoke that in the minds of the public because he's saying, listen, these Democratic lawmakers that want to slash budgets, that are avoiding accountability for their corruption charges. I'm not avoiding accountability for my corruption charges, by the way. Don't worry about that. But these other folks are trying to make us so unbelievably weak in the face of again, a belligerent enemy that we will not be able to fight and function, right? And they look and they say, look at Ukraine, right? A democratic country that itself has struggled to effectively mobilize, right? And the other Western democracies who have paid a ton of lip service, right? The lip service of the average Western country to Ukraine is like a 10 out of 10. Right? Remember, Zelensky was in Congress. They gave him a signed flag. They were like, you're great. We love this. But in practice, have they ever been given enough weapons and permissions to actually kick the Russians out of their occupied territory? The answer is no. The Russians can absorb everything the West has given Ukraine, and they just keep coming. And so for global leaders who know they need to be strong in the face of a dictator, they know that they have to be able to compete with these dictatorships, right? And the fact is that I think a lot of them are looking and they're saying democracies may not be able to do it. And this is one of those things that is a pretty simple and troubling calculus because it's not going to reverse. It would only reverse if democracies looked much, much stronger than their enemies, because ultimately it's a vicious cycle. The more scary and threatening the world looks, the more people want to feel like their government is going to be able to strongly and decisively respond. And the more conflict they see, the more people want an anti-democratic leader, the more an anti-democratic forces look more effective. And so you have this spiral where, the more anti-democratic forces kind of emerge, the more conflict there is, the more anti-democratic states look appealing, or anti-democratic forms of governance. And this is a core problem with a lot of democracies, is that they just they struggle to move decisively, but oftentimes that confers a bunch of benefits, right? Again, the South Korean economy is massive. Democracies seem to supercharge economies over generations. But again, democracies are only as good as they can defend themselves. It's sort of like, it's like saying, hey, there were probably tribes that didn't know violence, where no one engaged in violence and no one had ever heard of a weapon. But those ancient tribes didn't last long, because the first time they encountered a tribe that did perform violence, that did know what a weapon is, they got annihilated. So it doesn't matter. Like, all the feel-good shit in the world doesn't matter if you cannot protect yourself from the threats that exist. It's that simple, right? And so that's the fear people have, and that's one of the reasons why I talk about the fact that these things are signaling devices, that the conflict in Ukraine isn't a conflict, stopped becoming a conflict in a regional conflict in the Central Asia or Eastern Europe, and became a regional referendum on the effectiveness of democracy. And I think this is the first volley in an anti-democratic surge kind of going across the country. There's also, I think, some calculus here about South Korea's chief ally. Trump has spent a lot of time cozying up to and praising dictators. And so there's a sense that if you are a president like Yoon, he may have a sense that, listen, my chief ally, the United States, they're not going to abandon me if I become a dictator. In fact, I'm more likely to be praised and brought to the White House and given prestige and aid if I'm a dictator. I'm less likely to receive it if I am a democratically elected leader. And these are, again, the factors that you have to consider. It's one of the reasons why so many people were skeeved out by the fact that Trump was so complimentary towards autocratic dictators. Is, again, a lot of people fail to understand the way that messaging works. And sometimes it takes a long time, but it's not good. right? Or rather, if you think that dictatorships are better than democracies, then it's great. If you think they're not, it's a problem. Anyway, guys, that's really all I had. Huge thank you to Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergey Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall. Be sure to become a member over on combatvetnews.com. The video just dropped today, so I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.